ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Liberty McArtor.
Well, happy Monday and welcome to Point of View. I'm so glad that you're with me here around the roundtable today. It's going to be a good discussion. I have so many great panelists who are joining me in this hour and then more to come in the next hour as well. And we're really going to be taking a look at the issues of the day, both here in the U.S. and what's happening around the world as well. And as we like to do with the roundtable, we like to think in terms of the future. Where are we headed as a nation? Where are we headed as a group of Christian believers? And what does it mean for the next generations, those of us who are raising the leaders of the next generation and kind of shaping the future? And so I'm really glad that you're here for this conversation. Hopefully there will be a lot of food for thought. As a reminder, you can always follow along at pointofview.net. But let me welcome my co-host for this hour. Stephen Mosley is returning. Stephen, it's great to have you on again. You are a college administrator, teacher, school choice advocate, and the Evangelical Outreach Chair for Fairfax, Virginia GOP. So Stephen, thanks for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
And then we have Will Barclay with us again. He's a political theorist and consultant. Will, always great to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me. As always, it's a pleasure.
So I'm looking forward to getting insights from both of you today. Again, people can follow along with the articles that we've posted at pointofview.net, but I did want to start off with some news that happened over the weekend. As we know, unfortunately, we have just been seeing a lot of violence in the United States recently. It's been disturbing, and so we saw a tragic attack on a house of worship yesterday. If you didn't see the news, it was an LDS church in Grand Blanc, Michigan, that was attacked first by being rammed with the truck, set on fire, multiple gunshot victims. We know 3 to 4 casualties, I believe, and that includes the perpetrator. So he has been identified as a 40-year-old U.S. Marine veteran and Iraqi war veteran who potentially struggled with PTSD. So as investigators are looking into this, we do not have a particular motive yet. With some of the other recent attacks that we've seen, there have been very clear writings and manifestos, and it's completely obvious that it was politically motivated. We don't know the exact motivation here other than it was definitely motivated by hate. And so it's not to bring everybody down, too much to say, oh, well, here we go again. But that is kind of the sense, Stephen, when you see another of these headlines and you just think, what's happening to our nation? What is wrong that we keep seeing these kinds of attacks? I was wondering, what was your reaction?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of these issues because we don't have a Christ-centered culture, right? We don't have a place in our country where we're moving towards God and away from sin. That's the big issue. Why is this happening? The sin nature, the evil nature of man. And unfortunately, we don't know what the issue here, the motive is in this specific case, but we know in the last few, whether it was the Charlie Kirk assassination or whether it was the Catholic kids, etc., it has been from the left. It has been, unfortunately, many of them have been from the left. I thought I saw one of my favorite senators, quote unquote, online just the other day put out a post that said, yeah, a lot of this violence in the last 20 years has been happening from the left. And it really makes sense if you think about it. The left in this century has been focused on government control and has gone away from God. Whereas on the right, you have people who focus on government and are informed, but generally you would say we believe in God. And that belief and that faith in God understands no matter who's in power, God's in control. And so I would argue that we don't know what the issue here in this case is, but we do know it has an issue with the human heart, the sinful, evil human heart that's doing it, but also the focus of our nation. We need to get our nation back towards focusing on belief in God, following God, and living for God, and you'll see less of these things happen because spirit-filled people don't kill people.
Yeah, that's so wise. And just a reminder too, a lot of times when Christians are advocating for their belief systems to influence governmental policies, you often are met with pushback saying, well, people just call it Christian nationalism, even if technically that's not what you're arguing. Or they say, why should you push your beliefs on others? But when you have a moral grounding for your society, you can still have religious freedom, but everybody actually benefits. And I think, Will, a lot of people are starting to wake up to that, not just in the U.S., but kind of Western civilization in general. I know, and we'll get into this in more detail later, but you have documented how there's been an increase in violent crime in Canada as well. And so a lot of the same issues kind of, U.S. and Canada are neighbors, and there are kind of some similar trends going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another similar trend that we're also experiencing is kind of this purge or persecution of right-wing ideology. And I think that one of the things that actually sticks out to me about this attack, and I think it was really horrific, is that pretty much regardless of this person's particular political beliefs or ideology, this attack was very much a result of the political climate and the systematic campaign of violence that has been allowed to fester and has been fostered in America by the left. And what I mean to say by this is that whenever any populace or people starts to feel as though their rights are no longer being safeguarded by the state, maybe more so they stop believing in the state's legitimacy, right? They believe that they're no longer safe. And so they rescind their consent to the proverbial social contract and begin to abide by their own personal power and passions, very much disregarding the trappings of the state along with its laws and political processes in the process. And I think that's very much what we've seen happen here in the U.S. We've seen not just promoted by the left and their constant calls to violently overthrow President Trump's government and oppress conservative ideology and values over the past decade. But we've seen it actually culminate in the open attack and murder of conservative icons like President Trump himself, who survived various assassination attempts, and more recently Charlie Kirk, who was publicly executed simply because his right-wing values and ideology rendered him, I think the shooter said, the type of hate that you just can't fix. And I think in order to solve the problem and to cause this deplorable tide of violence to recede, it's vital for us to distinguish between the radical leftist ideology and extremism, the open violence and the systematic campaign of anti-conservative hatred that has caused this situation to manifest, and outbursts like the recent horrific attack at the LDS church, because the outbursts are themselves merely a symptom, or really a symptom very much, an immune response perhaps to the leftist disease and terrorism that is being permitted to shatter public safety in the U.S. and undermine the entire edifice and the legitimacy of human rights in America. I mean, certainly they're wrong and horrific, don't misunderstand me. I'm just saying that although they must be confronted, the symptoms of any disease will continue to occur in as much as we refuse to treat the disease itself.
Yeah, it's certainly, I think both of you are right. It is a root issue that is impacting our nation. And so, but there is hope, there is encouragement. So stick with us later in the hour. We're definitely going to be talking about in the wake of these horrific attacks, particularly Charlie Kirk's assassination. There has kind of been a wake-up call for a lot of people who are realizing in the face of such obvious evil that there has to be good, because if you are seeing the reality of evil and you cannot deny it, what is evil fighting against? And I think a lot of people are feeling that pull to something higher, to something greater, and they're starting to see that fundamental problem with the ideology that has become pervasive in our modern culture. So we're going to discuss that. But before, we also want to look at what's happening with Christians around the world, and we'll get into that right after this short break. So stay with us here on Point of View.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Christians have always needed discernment, but we especially need to develop our skill at discernment in this confused world. One book I would recommend is Why Bad Looks Good: Biblical Wisdom to Make Smart Choices in Life, Love, and Friendship. The author is Dr. Wendy Patrick. She is a career prosecutor with not only a law degree, but a master's degree and doctorate in theology. Her book helps you avoid falling victim to hazards of misperception that she's seen in courtrooms as well as in life. For example, she warns about the deception of public perception. We live in a world where abnormal is portrayed as normal. It is easy to follow the crowd right off the cliff. That is why her chapter begins with 2 Corinthians 4:4, where Paul reminds us that the God of this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers. Another chapter talks about when bad becomes beautiful. She has seen this in her experience in prosecuting sexual predators. That is why she begins that chapter with John 7:24, where Jesus admonishes the disciples to stop judging by mere appearances, but instead judge correctly. Another chapter advises us to use discernment when bad sounds good. We live in a world where smooth talkers can convince us and our friends of ideas that are counter to biblical wisdom. We should also be alert to the dark side of praise. Psalm 55:21 warns us about people whose talk is smooth as butter. Another chapter explains how to react when bad feels good. We live in a world that emphasizes emotion over logic and flash over substance. Ecclesiastes 1:8 warns us that the eye never has enough of seeing. If you want to improve your skill at discernment, I recommend you get a copy of her book. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to the Roundtable. Today, I'm talking with Stephen Mosley and Will Barclay. So you can follow along if you're just now joining us at pointofview.net with the articles that we've discussed. So we were talking about the tragic attack on a house of worship yesterday in Michigan. A Mormon church there was attacked. So definitely be keeping that community in your prayer. And we were in your prayers, and we were discussing, there are a lot of root issues in society that lead to these kinds of problems. And here in the United States and in the West, we've really been insulated from a lot of that. But something that you actually said one time right here on the Roundtable, Will, was that we often get too focused on what's happening in the United States or, over here in North America, when in reality there is so much happening around the world, particularly with regard to faith. And so I wanted to highlight an issue happening in Nigeria, and that is the slaughter of Christians. It's been going on for years, but it's not getting media attention. And so kudos to Bill Maher on Real Time over the weekend. He actually brought this up. And so I'll read just a couple of his comments on it. But he was saying that Boko Haram, which is a jihadist militant group in the region, is literally attempting to wipe out the Christian population of an entire country. And he says, where are the kids protesting this? They are systemically killing the Christians in Nigeria. So here are some numbers. They've killed over 100,000 Christians in Nigeria since 2009. They've burned 18,000 churches. So we're shocked and appalled, rightly, as we should be, when we see a house of worship attacked, set on fire here in the United States. But it is also just a stark reminder of what so many people are facing, the kind of persecution they've been facing their entire lives in other parts of the country. As of August in 2025 alone, 7,000 Christians had been murdered by Boko Haram. So, but again, if you want to talk about genocide, everybody's focused on Israel and Gaza. So, Will, I'll get your reaction here. This is really just a reminder that those protesting what's supposedly genocide aren't really educated about the reality of the rest of the world, are they?
No, I agree 100%. I mean, the title has a little blurb about the the slaughter being ignored because the Jews aren't involved. And to me, actually, the real glaring issue is not that the Jews aren't involved. I mean, that is part of it, certainly. I mean, when Mara's talking about no Jews being involved, maybe a better way to phrase it, though, would be that there's no group involved that can easily be identified as wholly white or altogether undiverse and thereby located as the inevitable kind of locus of oppression in the conflict and easily condemned. I mean, the gospel of modern identity politics and its intersectional apostles, let's say, have decreed that anyone who is sufficiently undiverse or white is not merely incapable of any socio-political suffering, but is actually themselves a source of political malaise and a locus of oppression. And what we've got here is two emphatically diverse, non-white black populations locked in conflict, one brutally oppressing the other. I think the liberal media just simply doesn't know what to do with it or where to go. But to be honest, the real reason, to me, I think that the slaughter of Christians in Nigeria is not being discussed is not that there are no Jews involved, but rather that the slaughter does involve Muslims as the slaughterers. Like you said, Boko Haram, the organization that has carried out this massacre and the overwhelming majority of all terrorist attacks in Nigeria, I think, is an Islamic terrorist organization. And since 9/11, there's been very much a concerted effort in the media and political society, which, again, I think is a space that's dominated by the left, to refuse to associate the Islamic religion with terrorism in really any capacity, even if it is ultimately relevant and groundbreaking news, like Mr. Meyer himself outlines. I mean, nobody's trying to throw asparagus here or cast aspersions, but we're just asking for accurate reporting, let's say, and facts are just facts. And I mean, this has all evolved into this kind of hyper-compensatory response whereby the media and many politicians openly refuse to condemn terrorists or report on terrorism if the terrorists are Muslim or diverse, let's say, really in any capacity. Because it's very much become verboten to all associate Islam with terrorism post 9/11. We can't say, for instance, now today that they're openly trying to exterminate Christians in Nigeria and that more Christians are killed for their faith in Nigeria than the rest of the world combined, simply because the answer to by who is a little bit uncomfortable. And that's simply not okay.
Yeah, interesting, pointing that out about the identity politics today, at least in our society. That is people's whole framework for understanding right and wrong and morality. Stephen, I'd love to get your thoughts, too.
Yeah, I think the privilege points of the CRT movement is really what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about...
Hey, Stephen, sorry, we're having a little trouble with your connection, so we'll maybe try to reconnect with you and then come back to that. But again, Will, as you were saying, here in the West, with the modern progressive ideology, identity politics is king. And so you are either oppressed or oppressor. And this kind of goes to the heart of the root issue that you and Stephen were both talking about a few minutes ago, is that there's no kind of common ground between the right and the left, and making generalizations, of course, but in terms of majority and understanding a moral framework. So on the one hand, you have people who are more likely to believe in a traditional moral framework, even if they don't really identify as Christians, at least biblical values, understanding of right and wrong. And then on the other hand, what has been escalated elevated is a form of Marxism, which is understanding that, there is an oppressed class and an oppressor class. And if you're in the oppressor class, then you are evil. And if you are a victim of an oppressor, then you are inherently good. So, okay, Stephen, I think we've got you back on the line. So keep going with your thoughts here.
Yeah, I was just saying that this comes with what you guys were saying. It's about the CRT idea, right? It's the worldview. It's always about a worldview. And the worldview here is like, we don't know who to blame because they're both black. And we definitely can't blame the Muslims, so we just better not talk about it. And unfortunately, that's the worldview that's sucked into society instead of just reporting facts and truth. I think as Christians, we need to understand as believers that this is what's happening around the world to our brothers and sisters. And this could also happen here. It's been so long that we've talked about how soft persecution happens here, hard persecution happens around the world. And now we're starting to see, at least in the last couple of months, maybe that is shifting. Maybe we are going to have to pay the cost for our faith here in America, just like our brothers and sisters are around the world. I'm glad that Bill Maher pointed out, it's kind of like the left is batting for 1,000. We had Fetterman pointing out, hey, these attacks happen on the left. We have Bill Maher saying, hey, he's a Jew, so he has a reason for saying this. He's like, hey, you can't blame Israel, so now we don't care about these things. And I think that's part of it over there in that part of the world. But I really do believe it comes down to a worldview. And as Christians, we need to be aware of the times. We need to be wise. And we also need to understand that Jesus calls us to give up our life for him. And there might come a time here in America where we're going to see the same type of persecution we're seeing there in Africa here.
Yeah. And that's just a reminder for us to be praying. One, pray for all God's people. I would recommend for anybody out there listening, if you don't already do this, be reading Ephesians 6 every single day, because there is a spiritual battle that is being waged behind the scenes. But I think we are definitely seeing the effects of that. And so put on the armor of God. And we need to be arming ourselves with that truth. But at the end of that passage, it says, always pray for all God's people. And just, an encouragement. I know I need to remember this. How often do we really make an intentional decision to say, I'm going to pray for the persecuted believers around the world today? And so I wanted to highlight this. There are, again, so many different reasons to discuss it and ways that we can discuss it and reasons that it is important. But number one, just so that you can know to be praying for these believers. And if you haven't, and this is another quote from Bill Maher, he says, if you don't know what's going on in Nigeria, then, well, basically your media sources aren't that good. And he says you are in a bubble. And I think that's true of a lot of media today. But I do know that there are organizations who advocate on behalf of persecuted religious minorities around the world to designate Nigeria as a country of particular concern. In President Trump's first administration, Nigeria was a country of particular concern, or CPC. That designation was lifted under the Biden administration, but there is an effort to get that designation again. And so I also want to highlight something that I read in World Magazine talking about how you can contact your representatives, because America does still have influence on the world stage, and some of the policies and foreign policies that we implement here can have an impact to motivate other nations as well. So this is not an official action item that we have at pointofview.net, even though we will update that and maybe get this on the radar soon. But contact your representatives and encourage them that this is an issue that matters to you, religious freedom around the world as well, and making sure that the United States is standing for that and just highlighting awareness of the issue for your lawmakers and your representatives. And so that's something that you can do. But when we come back, we want to turn our focus back to the West. We're going to talk about a recent article that Will has published that looks at specifically what's happening in Canada. And again, that stark difference between leftist policies and more conservative policies, and what are the ramifications when the left wins for a really long time. So we'll talk about that and more right after this short break.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Liberty McArtor.
Welcome back to the Roundtable. I'm joined by Stephen Mosley and Will Barclay. We've been having a great discussion so far, but I did want to mention something briefly. If you weren't able to listen last week, maybe you were out of town, we did have our Truth Team Week, which we have twice a year. It's where we raise support for Point of View, which is a listener-funded ministry, and it has been for over 50 years. And so we had a goal of raising $150,000 last week, but we fell short, so we still have $70,000 to go. And so I'm bringing that up because I want to encourage you, if you didn't have a chance to give last week, know that it's not too late. And if you were listening on Friday, you may have heard that right at the last minute, we had someone call in and challenge others to give. They gave a matching challenge of up to $10,000. There's still $1,300 of that match left. So if you call in right now or you go to pointofview.net to give a donation, including a monthly donation, that will be doubled. So we really don't want to leave any of that match money on the table, and we do need to hit our fundraising goal, and it's not too late to help us out. So if you would like to call in, you can do so at 1-800-347-5151. Or, as always, you can go to pointofview.net and click donate. And for Truth Team members who are our monthly supporters, we have some really awesome gifts available. And so there's still time to take advantage of those. So just an encouragement to you to support the work that we do here, because we really do rely on you in order to keep doing that. But let's move on to talk about your recent article, Will. It was published in the Western Standard. We do have it posted at pointofview.net, as well as so many other resources. But you say Canada is a failing state, and you actually kind of look at a lot of the different reasons why you call it a failing state. It's not without evidence. And so we're talking everything from an increase of crime, terrorism, open borders, and things that have come from leftist policies. And so this is relevant for us listening because we want to know, hey, what's happening with our allies? What's happening around the world, and how are these policies affecting us? So, Will, I'd love for you to take us through some of the things that are happening in Canada, and what's the warning here? What do we need to learn from this?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. I think that, as you were saying, for decades, the Canadian state has consistently located itself at the vanguard of progress and national excellence. Unfortunately, though, since the advent of our liberal government about a decade ago, we've been forced to endure a precipitous national decline, and that's very much culminated now in Canada displaying the quintessential hallmarks or the official criteria of a failing or failed state. Right? And this isn't just kind of my belief; these are the official criteria in international relations, or IR, right, for any failing or failed state. And the first of this is that the Canadian state is unable to maintain a monopoly on the legitimate use of force within its borders and society. For example, since 2015, violent crime in Canada has increased by over 30%. Our homicide rate recently hit a 30-year peak, and in 2022, our violent crime severity index surpassed its highest point since 2007. In addition, like you were saying, Islamic terrorism has become endemic in Canada. According to the RCMP, terrorism charges laid in Canada jumped by over 488% last year, so it's not insignificant at all. And according to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute itself, we've been forced to endure a surge in violent crime across every province, and hardly a day passes without some heartbreaking story of some violent crime or terrorism in at least one of Canada's major cities. The second criteria is that the Canadian state has become emphatically unable to secure its borders as a result of the Liberal government's severely inadequate immigration policies and summary inability to effectively regulate the flux of international migration into Canada. For instance, various Canadian premiers, such as the Premier of Ontario and the Premier of Alberta, have for years very much actually emphatically reiterated that swarms of illegal migrants, extremists, and criminals, as well as vast quantities of illicit substances, have surged freely in and out of Canada as a result of our utter inability to secure our borders. Even our disgraced former Prime Minister himself has recently been forced to admit that our borders have become utterly porous, and that, what do you say, bad actors have been exploiting our immigration system, his immigration system, very much, Liberal parties at least, for their own interests. And I mean, over this past decade, the Liberal government's shameful inability to secure our borders has permitted a diverse array of criminal organizations to transform the Canadian state into a global hub for the export of countless narcotics and criminals and terrorists. And I think the worst part of this is that it's very much compromised our relationship with the United States of America. Our national failure has not at all remained confined to our borders in the Canadian state. Our relationship, as I was saying, with the U.S. has collapsed specifically because our borders have permitted the open anarchy and violence that now typifies Canadian society to bleed over into the USA and endanger innocent American citizens with terrorism and mass murder. In fact, I think very much although America has remained Canada's ally and a bulwark for Canadians everywhere, it's clear that our relationship, our historic relationship, in fact, with the U.S. will remain very much a thing of the past until we cease to represent a national security threat to the American people.
Mm. You know, Stephen, we've heard here in the U.S. multiple times when people don't like the way that politics are going, well, I'm just going to move to Canada. Maybe they should rethink that. What are your thoughts?
You know what? I'm saying no. If they want to move to Canada, it sounds like they need to move to Canada. It's one of those things I was looking online, and so it's like, I'm moving to Canada. And they get there and like, wait, it's so expensive. Wait, the crime is still bad. I don't know. And it's like, yeah, exactly. You know, and that's why as an American, I'm always saying, look, where are you going to go? Mm-hmm. You know, this is the best place to be for freedom if we can keep it. And Will was just going off a litany of problems. I'm like, yeah, those are all liberal policies come to fruition, and it's not working out so well for Canada. And so it's one of those things of like, as Christians, this is why we must stay involved. I look at the COVID era, and you see what happened. In America, we got the beauty of the 10th Amendment. We got to see different states do different things, and successful states like Florida and Texas, they saw an increase of people moving there because they wanted freedom for their kids. They wanted freedom to live. You saw progressive states like New York and California lose people because they were doing lockdowns and other things that did not work. In Canada, you saw similar things that was happening in our liberal states. You saw them persecute the church, couldn't meet, couldn't preach, etc. You saw them have things that, based on liberal policies, where there was the immigration issue we just talked about or the free speech issue, it went against our values. And as Christians, you say, what do I do with this? I need to stand. I keep preaching from Romans 1, even if the government tells me I can't. I continue to allow Jesus to use me because God, through the power of his Holy Spirit, through the preaching of his word, will transform minds and hearts in Christ Jesus. And that is our focus. Our focus is our eternal home. Not just here, but the unique part about it is when you read through the book of James, it tells you that when we apply God's word, it brings a blessing to us. And so when we do that in public policy, it will also bring blessings to our fellow countrymen. Yeah,
that's so great. Thank you, Stephen. Now, we've only got about a minute and a half before we go to a break, but then we can come back and talk about it. But Will, I did see you tweet out a couple weeks ago that there's a desire for a movement like Turning Point USA in Canada. Before we go to the break quickly, do you want to shed any light on that or share kind of what are young people feeling right now?
Well, 100%. I think that very much one of the problems is that in Canada, right-wing ideology and conservative values have been oppressed for over a decade, right? And I think that with Charlie Kirk's murder, the youth of Canada very much saw themselves and saw what was happening to us. I think it's 43% of the Canadian youth actually is in favor of American annexation or leaving the Canadian state because there's no future here. And I think that it's not an accident, let's say, mind you, that the two phenomena have gone hand in hand, the collapse of the Canadian state and the Liberal government's efforts to oppress right-wing ideology and persecute conservative values. And so, yeah, I think very much the Canadian youth saw themselves in Charlie Kirk and his murder, and they're very much being galvanized to take up this cause of conservative values and conservative ideology and restore some structure and some order and maybe the pursuit of the good and objective truth to Canadian public discourse.
Yeah, and that is so encouraging to see. And we've seen reports, too, which we'll talk about later in the show, some of the specifics, but around the world, in Europe, in Asia, people who were just shocked at what happened to Charlie Kirk and yet also inspired. And so it really is, I I think, accelerating maybe a movement or a feeling that was already there for a lot of people. So we want to pray for that, and we'll talk about that more. We're coming to a break, though, so this is a great time, as I was saying a few minutes ago, to call in and support Point of View. We had our Truth Team Week last week, but we're about $70,000 short of our goal. So you can help us get there. Call now. It's a great time. We're going to go to a break. 1-800-347-5151. Or you can always go to pointofview.net and donate there. It's very easy. Point of View is listener funded. So because of you, we are able to bring you the truth and highlight these issues that have to do with your faith, family, and freedom. So if you appreciate that perspective, then I would ask that you support Point of View. So again, pointofview.net or 800-347-5151. We'll be back in just a few minutes.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Just a few minutes left in today's first hour of our roundtable, but we have another hour to come, so don't go anywhere. Keep listening. It's been such a great conversation so far. And Stephen, I wanted to turn it to you for a few minutes because you emailed me about this, and I do want to acknowledge it. Last week on Thursday, Vadi Bakum Jr., who is an American pastor, an author, an educator, and impacted so many people in his ministry, including, I imagine, many Point of View listeners. So he died last Thursday after a sudden medical emergency. And this is another, at least in the United States, as far as I know, example of just many very influential figures who have been very bold, speaking about Christian values and having these very influential ministries dying. And so this is, a lot of people are losing influencers, for lack of a better word, who have been very important and impactful for them. And so I want to talk about the broader implications of that. But first, Stephen, just feel free to share, what his death and life and ministry has meant for you.
Oh, thank you so much for this opportunity.
All right. Well, we're gonna come back to you in a moment, Stephen. I think we had a little trouble with the line again, but Will, this is somebody who just reading his and to be honest, I definitely knew about Voddie Baucham. I wasn't personally super familiar with his ministry before Charlie Kirk's assassination. I definitely knew about Charlie Kirk, but honestly, I wasn't as familiar with Turning Point either. However, what I have seen in the wake of their deaths is just more and more information about how consistent they were with their values and their beliefs. They were very authentic, not just preaching a message of values and objective moral truths, but actually applying that in their own lives. And it reminds me of what you were saying, that there is a movement, I think, around the world, really, of youth who are desiring that kind of authenticity and that realness, and they're attracted to people who are speaking about it boldly. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah, 100%. Actually, a quote that's like out to me from the article was that perhaps the best word to define the life and ministry of Baucham was excellence. And so excellence to me is a dynamic state of being, just like, let's say, shalom or peace in Hebrew is an active, dynamic peace. Things aren't at rest, let's say. Rather, they're an active, perfect embodiment of life, living and being present. And so excellence, to me, is a constant striving and a perpetual commitment to pursue and exemplify the good and greatness with capital G's. And I think that the excellence, this pursuit of excellence, is invariably predicated upon an unshakable belief in the existence of an a priori objective truth and good, as well as evil. And Baucham's constant striving for excellence, and not just the purpose, but the happiness that it conferred upon him and his life, I think are really something that struck me. It really makes me think of the liberal apathy that has seeded so much of the left and the damage it has caused, not just to American society, but in their own lives. And to me, in my opinion, due to the fact that the modern left has long rejected this notion of objective truth and excised any a priori unwavering good and evil from their political discourse and paradigm, modern leftist ideology has left this utterly bereft of any true meaning. And so they constantly struggle to imbue their lives with purpose. And therefore, modern leftists are very much forced to constantly manufacture and insert themselves into political conflict in an effort to once more provide their lives with meaning and then briefly stave off the abortive spiral into depression and oblivion that inevitably awaits any long-term adherent of left-wing ideology who introspects for too long even. More important, I think it's readily apparent that until modern left-wing ideology begins to once more acknowledge and accept this notion of an objective good and evil, until everyone does kind of within its political ideology and discourse, leftists are doomed to continue sporadically erupting into the violence that we've seen so much recently, and angst very much, in an effort to once more, let's say, imbue their lives with some modicum of meaning or purpose. I think it's just an inevitable thing.
Yeah, definitely we're seeing the difference between having a foundation that is rooted in objective moral truth and having a foundation that is rooted in relativism. But Stephen, are you back on the line with us?
I am. Can you hear me now?
Well, we're still a little rough, so we're going to try one more time and get you back on, because I'd love to get your thoughts on Voddie Baucham's legacy. But while we're trying to work on that, yeah, Will, I totally agree. And so this is just an encouragement to, when we look at, the life and legacy of those who are living according to that moral framework. And when they have a strong belief system and they're willing to stake their life on it and not just talk about it, but actually live it out, that is so powerful. And I think that is really what is stirring in so many people's hearts right now is that sense of knowing that they really believed what they talked about. So when we are thinking about, okay, what's going on in the culture, what's happening here with politics, what's happening with the hate that we're seeing, yes, we need to vote for better policies. We need political movements. We need things that are going to mobilize people toward a better future for their society. But it all starts really inwardly. It has to start with us, the individual. And I think that's why you're seeing so many people kind of seek out some sort of moral foundation by going to church again and picking up a Bible or trying to, look at preachers and say, what is objective morality? What is good and evil anyways? But it really does start with us, doesn't it, Will?
No, I agree with you 100%. I think very much it coincides with this modern advent of identity politics, where we've seen identities rather than actions become wrong, right? And so in a way, you're kind of mired in the situation. Let's say if you've been labeled or fixed with one of these unsavory identities, with that faith for life, you're unable to transform your situation, right? And I think that's very much kind of the paradigm that's been adopted by the left, right? They're stuck in a dark room with no light anywhere, right? And so if their life isn't anything but perfect, or is at all incomprehensible to them, they're unable to remedy their condition at all, right? And I think that this is very much kind of the apathy that kind of assails them nowadays, right? Whereas conservatives, anyone with some kind of objective morality or ethos at all, they're locked in the same dark room, but they have a light off in the distance, and so at least they know how to orient themselves. At least there's some kind of hope or future for them. I think this is the problem with the left. There's no future for them, and so they become abortive, nihilistic, and they seek to maybe act like Samson and pull everything down around their ears.
Yeah. So, I mean, we want to get into really the why, and hopefully this has helped, people understand, like it's not just, everybody's acting crazy for no reason or what's happening to my country. There are ideologies, there are fundamental beliefs that are driving people's actions. And if you really want to change society, you have to look at what those fundamental beliefs are and those fundamental ideologies. So we're, for some reason, having a hard time connecting with Stephen. So hopefully we can get him back on the roundtable before too long. But he did retweet this after Vadi Bakkum's death. And so I just wanted to read it because I know he had thoughts on this. But this was something that he retweeted just a couple days ago. There is no next John MacArthur, another Bible teacher that recently passed away. There is no next Vadi Bakkum. There is no next Charlie Kirk. God has never sent us duplicates of faithful Christians. We get one of each. This is God showing us that we do not depend on men. We depend on Jesus, and we have him. And so again, an encouragement to you who are listening, as we've been discussing this whole hour, as Will and I have been discussing, you have to be rooted in an objective moral truth. You have to be rooted in something bigger than yourself. And so hopefully we have helped you, help provide you with that biblical worldview here on Point of View. But we're about to go to a break. Stay with us, though, because we have more to discuss today on the roundtable. And thank you so much to Stephen and Will for being with us. If you want to check out their work and follow them, you can find links to everything that they're working on at pointofview.net. We'll be right back after this break.
America's founding was shaped by a biblical worldview, but you will rarely hear that truth today. Think about this. If your child or grandchild was asked to articulate how Christian values shaped America's founding based on the education they received in school and from popular media, could they do it? Well, you can be part of restoring an appreciation for America's godly heritage, and we need you. Truth Team Week is right around the corner, kicking off September 22nd, and you're invited to participate in Point of View's mission to restore America's godly heritage and a Christian worldview in this nation by joining the Truth Team. But you don't have to wait to make a difference. You can make a donation right now and learn more about the Truth Team by visiting us online at pointofview.net. or by calling 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. 5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Thank you, Kirby. I really appreciate your program. You cover a lot of issues that a lot of us think about, I'm sure. And this is the first time I've ever called in, so I appreciate your input, too.
Oh, I thank God for what you're doing on Point of View. You guys have more influence across this country than I believe any of them in terms of tackling the issues and getting the truth out to Americans. It's getting to the point where truth just is bottled up on every hand. Every time you turn around, there's another big bottleneck against truth. I hope your listeners realize what Point of View is doing and supports Point of View in every possible way you can.
You know, I can't go to Washington. I can't do those things, so the only way that I can help is the way that God has provided for me and to give some of that back to you guys. So, like you said, partnering with Point of View because, you know, you can't do it alone. Thank you very much for what you guys do. Believe me, it's a needed thing, and I just hope everybody certainly would get on the bandwagon with you.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Liberty McArtor.
Thanks for being with us on Point of View today. We've been having a great discussion so far around the roundtable, and this hour I'm joined by two new co-hosts, Richard Lim, host of This American President podcast, and Joshua Barnes, pastor and host of The Bible Explained on YouTube, both excellent resources that you should check out. So Richard and Josh, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
Great to be here.
So the last time we were all on Point of View together, it was September 11th, and we were just a day after the tragic assassination of Charlie Kirk. And so now, almost 3 weeks out, we are really starting to see the effect that has had in our nation. And so I want to talk about that, including what some are calling a revival, but definitely a stirring in so many hearts toward what Kirk talked about most strongly and fervently, which was his faith. But I do want to kind of highlight this article that was in the Wall Street Journal by Peggy Noonan last week, Charlie Kirk and the New Christian GOP. So Peggy Noonan is reflecting on the Charlie Kirk Memorial and really noting a shift in which, as somebody who has reported on the Republican Party and politics for many years, a shift that she is noticing in the Republican Party specifically. So she's talking about, one of the things she says is that when she was watching just the presentations from public figures, from politicians, openly discussing their Christian faith, really just evangelizing and sharing the gospel time after time. It says she said, this is the true sound and tone of the Republican Party right now. This is the takeover of the previously patronized. And what she means by that is that previously, even though you had the so-called moral majority and, kind of had more Christians in America getting involved with politics and leaning conservative, that at that time, evangelical Christians had a seat at the table. But now she argues that they're at the head of the table. And this is the new explicitly Christian direction of the Republican Party. So I think it's an interesting observation from her experience. I'm not sure exactly what I think about it, but Richard, let me start with you as a historian and kind of looking at the shift that the GOP has made in the last decade or so. What are your thoughts on just like the moment that we're seeing right now and some of the things that we're hearing from public figures, especially after Charlie Kirk's death?
You know, Peggy Noonan's article, the one you're referencing in the Wall Street Journal, really gave voice to something that I was feeling watching the memorial, because I honestly could not remember a time where I've seen any program, any ceremony, funeral service of a public figure involving so many public figures that was so explicitly Christian. Mm-hmm. It was remarkable. It was just so encouraging to see. It's something that is exposing many fissures, not just in this country, but within conservatism and within Christianity, trends that have been brewing for a long time now. And you have, lots of churches where people are decrying this sort of thing, calling it Christian nationalism. And then you have other churches that are embracing it and saying that this is a revival. And I'm glad that these issues are coming to a head, because this is a time that we can have real clarity on what it means to be a Christian and what it means to testify to your faith, whether you're a public figure or not. I also think that the fact that Christianity is being so explicitly embraced by public figures is a reaction to the fact that the left has pushed this country so far left that it's inspired a profound backlash. People are disillusioned with the false promises of far left secularism and the muzzling of any expression of truth and faith. It's led to this big backlash where you see people who are rising up and just saying, enough of this, I'm going to be explicit about my faith in Jesus Christ. So praise God for the work that he's doing. Whether it results in a revival or not, we'll see. But it's up, God is the one who moves hearts, and whether it's going to be a huge revival or whether it's going to be a continuation of the remnant that we're seeing, which is going to be the case anyways, we'll see what God is doing. But I was so encouraged by it.
Yeah, and one of the things that Vice President J.D. Vance said, and we'll talk more about him later in this hour, that he said in his speech at the memorial that he had talked more about Jesus Christ in the last 2 weeks in public than he had in his entire career in politics, which I thought that was pretty cool. So, Josh, I'd love to get your take as well.
Yeah, the hard thing on the show is always deciding what thing to talk about because there's so many lines here to follow. But
yes.
I would say that, but probably the main thing that pops out to me is the idea of boldness. And what we're seeing is a revival. Now, some people think of revival and they think of this huge, impactful thing. It might become that kind of real revival. It may not ever be that kind of revival, but right now it is a revival. It's people being revived. And what revival is at its base level is when Christians become bold, when Christians stop being afraid to carry out the cause of Christ and to go into all the world and to teach all nations to observe whatsoever Jesus has commanded us, because all power is given unto him. When we actually become bold to do that, that's revival. And that's what's happening. And so again, there's so many things to say, but one of the neat things about this is that it's all happening because of a man who is not only a sincere and true and honest a Christian apologist and a defender of the faith, but also was political. And that was the thing. I mean, we're all millennials here. We know what it was like growing up in the 90s, that you weren't allowed to mix faith and politics. The best you could ever do is say, God bless America. And even that, you kind of said it with a lump in your throat, afraid that you might get attacked for it. Now, it's not just God bless America. It's Jesus Christ is the only hope for America. We need Jesus. You need to go to church. That's awesome. That's what we've been missing. And really, if I could kind of summarize, although I have many more thoughts, if you look at when political movements begin to be successful, it's when they stop being afraid. That's what the whole Pride movement is, the Pride Month for the LGBTQ. It's not really about pride. It is about pride, but it's the point that they're trying to get to is they're unashamed. They should be ashamed, but they are unashamed of their choices, and it's supposed to create boldness in them so that they will win the culture. And they were successful at that for a long period of time. Now Christians are starting to be bold, and Christians are starting to have courage, and we're seeing what that does to the culture, which is a very positive thing.
Absolutely. And even though we're about to go to a break, we can continue discussing this when we come back, because it is such a big movement happening in the culture right now. And just before we go to the break, I would encourage anyone, pray for those who are feeling something stirring. Even if it started in politics, pray for those who are being pulled to church and step up and disciple somebody. So we'll keep talking about this and so much more after this short break on Point of View.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Christians have always needed discernment, but we especially need to develop our skill at discernment in this confused world. One book I would recommend is Why Bad Looks Good: Biblical Wisdom to Make Smart Choices in Life, Love, and Friendship. The author is Dr. Wendy Patrick. She is a career prosecutor with not only a law degree, but a master's degree and doctorate in theology. Her book helps you avoid falling victim to hazards of misperception that she's seen in courtrooms as well as in life. For example, she warns about the deception of public perception. We live in a world where abnormal is portrayed as normal. It is easy to follow the crowd right off the cliff. That is why her chapter begins with 2 Corinthians 4:4, where Paul reminds us that the God of this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers. Another chapter talks about when bad becomes beautiful. She has seen this in her experience in prosecuting sexual predators. That is why she begins that chapter with John 7:24, where Jesus admonishes the disciples to stop judging by mere appearances, but instead judge correctly. Another chapter advises us to use discernment when bad sounds good. We live in a world where smooth talkers can convince us and our friends of ideas that are counter to biblical wisdom. We should also be alert to the dark side of praise. Psalm 55:21 warns us about people whose talk is smooth as butter. Another chapter explains how to react when bad feels good. We live in a world that emphasizes emotion over logic and flash over substance. Ecclesiastes 1:8 warns us that the eye never has enough of seeing. If you want to improve your skill at discernment, I recommend you get a copy of her book. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
With us, thanks for being with us here on Point of View. So something that people have been talking about is the Charlie Kirk effect. So, and again, kind of anecdotally at this point, but many ministry leaders and pastors are saying that they are seeing an increase in church attendance. And I think, all it takes is really opening up social media. I have seen so many posts from people that I follow and people that I didn't follow before, and then articles that are citing more posts like that saying, after this tragic thing that happened, people who previously identified as atheist, or maybe they had kind of fallen away from church, they didn't know what they believed, all of a sudden they're saying, okay, so I want to go to church. I feel, and there's a common descriptor that is being used by different unconnected people saying, I feel a pull towards God and I feel like I need to go to church. And they're saying, okay, how do I do this? Or, I bought a Bible, and Bible sales were already up because we were already kind of seeing this movement, especially with Gen Zers, which was exciting. And I think that everything that has happened has just accelerated it. So again, there are people who are, raising concerns about Christian nationalism, saying that maybe it's not always good when government and religion are so intertwined. Are people going to mistake, identifying with the Republican Party as being a Christian? And then, people who don't like Charlie Kirk's legacy and didn't like his politics and the things that he advocated for. And so they're saying, well, he shouldn't be the one that's sparking a revival to begin with. What I would say is, if you are a Christian believer and you are seeing people for whatever reason all of a sudden going to church, that is a reason to celebrate. And if you're concerned about people getting confused about the intersection of politics and religion, all the more reason for you to get involved with those who are coming to church and interested and pointing out that Jesus is the only answer. But Richard, I think this was something you were saying before. The reason that people are reacting to that and feeling so bold and saying that, Jesus is the only answer for our country is because it has been pushed so far in the opposite direction by the left. And so people who have grown up like Gen Z with these policies or with these ideologies, all of a sudden they are faced with kind of the evil that leads to, and saying, okay, if there's no moral framework here, if there's no objective right and wrong, then this is where it leads, and I want to be on the other side. And I think that maybe that's what's pushing them to seek out something different. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things in history where you look through different cycles of society. Society goes through times, hard times, when people turn away from God, and then it often sparks a revival of some sort. And then, unfortunately, things go the other way, where the nation enjoys prosperity, but then it turns away from the things of God, and then the hard times come back. And it speaks a lot to the human condition that even when God does bless our country with good things, with prosperity being a good thing, economic prosperity, spiritual prosperity, eventually, human sin finds a way and turns it around. But thankfully, we know that God can take these situations when great evil is being done and people turn away from God and embrace this secular moral relativism. And despite the tragedy of that and the real cost of that, he uses that to open people's eyes and bring clarity to what is true. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. And I was really marveling at just how bold people are, as was discussed just a few minutes ago. The fact that, I lived in the D.C. area when Bush was president, and I remember during that time it was kind of the era of compassionate conservatism and trying to appeal to the middle. And it was almost a passive thing where you were trying to convince people in kind of an underhanded way, hey, I'm not one of those crazy conservatives. I'm a compassionate conservative. That was the view, and it didn't work because people still hated them. But instead, what we're seeing now is boldness, unapologetic boldness, and I think people respond to that in a way that the way they respond to truth. They can take it or they can leave it. They can accept it or leave it, and it's so much more honest. And I think for many people, it's much more appealing because at least in its honesty, it presents to you, this is what we genuinely believe. And so I pray that God continues to use that and brings more people to the Word and to truth and into a relationship with His Son.
Yeah, well said. Josh, I know you said you had other thoughts too, so feel free to take it any direction you'd like.
Yeah, and maybe I'd like to hear Richard's thoughts on this as well, because from his perspective as a historian. But if you look at history, you find that revivals are almost always connected with political movements. And the reason is because it is expected that when we are successful in our endeavors to preach the gospel, that it will change politics. The Jewish, the apostles in the book of Acts preached to the Jewish religious and political leaders. They would have had no understanding of people repenting and not changing politics in their time. And we see this throughout history. If you look at the Reformation, that was both religious and political, and it brought great revival. You've got William Wilberforce, who applied the principles of the Bible to this issue of slavery, and it coincided with the Great Awakening. You have all throughout history, you have great revivals connected with attaching our faith to politics and seeing that, as Paul said, we are using the sword of the Spirit to war against the demons that are behind principalities in Ephesians chapter 6. So behind rulers of this world are demons, and we fight them with the gospel, but we are actually fighting against those political powers. And so those two things are inextricably linked together, I think. And the idea that we're going to have a revival by sitting over here on the sideline and saying, I'm not going to talk about abortion, or I'm not going to talk about that, I'm not going to fight for that, I'm just going to talk about the gospel. Well, Charlie Kirk showed us that was incorrect.
Yeah, Richard, your thoughts on the political connection there between revival and politics throughout history?
Amen. And, the thing is that there's been this, the same crowd that complains so much about quote-unquote Christian nationalism doesn't have an answer for what your faith is supposed to do in the public square. There are all these people that, they look at patriotism and see it as a form of Christian nationalism. I think as Christians, we should be grateful. We should praise God for the fact that he used Christians in so many ways in this country and throughout the Western world. And scholars are realizing this. There's a scholar at Harvard. His name is Eric Nelson, and he's a Harvard professor. So, I don't know what his views are, but he's not coming from a explicitly Christian institution. But he said right out in his scholarship that the existence of republics, of free democratic representative societies, is because of the rise of a greater understanding of Christianity that happened through the Reformation, and it happened as a result of a better understanding of Scripture. And when people look at, let's say, Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Thomas Paine was a deist, but he used a Christian argument to argue against a king. He cited Scripture, and he cited the Hebrew Republic. So it was really the outgrowth of people's faith and greater understanding that led to this country. And I think we should be grateful for that, not to shout it down as Christian nationalism.
Yeah, man, it's I love the insights that both of you bring, and it's always so great whenever it's a roundtable day, because we get to talk about these issues, and you get to benefit from hearing people like Josh and Richard. And so I just appreciate that so much. And I also want to encourage you, if you're listening, if you're just now tuning in and you weren't listening last week or you weren't able to participate, it was our Truth Team Week at Point of View. And so we rely on listener funding. And Point of View's mission has always been to help Americans apply a biblical worldview to every single issue, including politics, including family formation, including culture. And so that's what we're all about. That's why we talk about these issues from a Christian perspective on Point of View. But we are short of our goal for that fundraising week, but there's still time for you to give. So I want to encourage you to pray about doing that and supporting the ministry that we do here if you appreciate these conversations. So you can do that by calling 1-800-347-5151, or you can easily give at pointofview.net, where we also have many resources for you, including the articles that we're discussing today. They're going to a break, so it's a great time to call or hop online to give. Again, the number is 1-800-347-5151 or pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Liberty McArtor.
Well, we're all millennials on the roundtable today, I think, and so is the vice president. And so we have an article posted at pointofview.net from National Review, J.D. Vance's Delicate Dance, basically just taking a few minutes today to look ahead to the future because President Donald Trump is in his second term. And so it's time to start thinking about what does the country, what do politics, what does the White House potentially look like in a post-Trump era? And he has been such a dominant force in politics over the last decade. It's kind of hard to imagine moving on. But this is an article basically just talking about, what are Vance's chances? I didn't intend to rhyme there. But speaking of being a millennial, I will say something that is kind of hipsterish. I read Hillbilly Elegy before J.D. Vance was ever in politics. So there's my little hipster qualification there. But Richard, I'll start with you. Just obviously somebody who's the vice president is, I think oftentimes kind of looked at as the person to probably be the next candidate. We've certainly seen that pattern. And so just, feel free to talk about the historical pattern, your thoughts on J.D. Vance, what you think the future of the GOP might look like. I'd love to get your historical perspective here as well.
Sure. So it is a very, very defensible statement, as the author of that article made, that he has about as good a chance to be president as anybody right now. A few things to point out. Historically, VPs are basically guaranteed the nomination for their party, but it is quite difficult for a VP to get elected to the presidency directly. So ever since Martin Van Buren did it in 1836, it's only happened once. Literally just once. That's almost 200 years, almost the whole history of the country. It's only happened once since 1836. That was George Bush 41 in 1988. The other VPs who tried, Nixon, Humphrey, and Gore, all got the nomination but lost. It's far more common for a VP to become president through death. Happened 8 times since. Or actually after leaving the vice presidency, which is what happened with Nixon and Biden. And there are a lot of reasons for this. I consider the vice presidency one of the most awkward, maybe the most awkward office in the country. It's kind of like the appendix of the government. It's not really that useful. Some have compared it to the booster on a space shuttle. It's necessary to get you into space, i.e. to win the White House, but once it gets there, they just discard it. Vice presidents have to deal with the fatigue of one party being in office for too long, the failures of the incumbent president, the difficulty of a VP being loyal to the president while also looking out for his own future, the tension of looking forward while also looking for credit in the past. So he has his work cut out for him, but he has a lot in favor of him, the fact that he's very popular in the Republican base, and the fact that he only has to wait 4 years. Most VPs have to wait 8 years. I think his success will depend on 3 factors. The first is basically his relationship with Trump. As long as that stays good, he's going to be in good standing with the party. Whether or not the American people want more of Trumpism in 3 years, and also how bad the Democrats get. There are parties that still remain in power, even though they're not as popular, but because the alternative is worse. It's happened a few times in American history. So all of these things can work in J.D. Vance's favor. If I had to bet, I would say he probably is the front runner for 2028. He has the best chance. But, of course, he's got to play his cards right. He's got to keep having good relationship with President Trump. And as long as the Democrats keep shooting themselves in the foot, his chances will look even better.
Yeah, it definitely is awkward because there's that tension of arguing that I'm going to make the country better, but what about all the policies that you were supporting with the president that we didn't necessarily like? So, yeah, it's tough. And a lot can happen. A lot can happen in 3 years still. But I always appreciate that perspective and just the numbers, looking at the historical pattern. So really, Richard, it seems like what you're saying is if J.D. Vance wins the nomination and is directly elected the next president, that's going to be historically profound. So interesting. Josh, what are your thoughts on J.D. Vance, his future in politics and the next presidential election?
Yeah, political strategy isn't really my forte. I enjoy listening to other people talk about it. But I will say that as a Christian and as a strong conservative, I love J.D. Vance. And I think the reason is because he is bold. And so I see this as a very similar conversation in my mind to what we were talking about in the first half of this hour. And that is that bold conservatism, bold Christians, they are successful, and timid ones are not. And I think the reason why people are saying J.D. Vance, is because he hasn't been that sort of spaceship booster engine in this presidency. He's really been very visible, very out in front. He's been out as the bull, arguing for President Trump's policies, and he's done so very articulately. And I think a lot of us are pleased with someone who can articulate the positions that Trump has better than Trump can, because we're maybe feel like it should be articulated better. And he does that. And so I think we see him as like the Trump 2.0. Like he could bring a lot of the same vigor and zeal and not backing down that we love about Trump, but do it in a more articulable way. And I think that's awesome. And also to what we were talking about earlier, at the memorial service for Charlie Kirk, he won the hearts, I think, of many Christians by making the statement that he hadn't talked much about his faith in his public life because he was always embarrassed about it. I think we can all identify with that, at least us millennials, like we said earlier, that we grew up kind of religion and politics, you don't talk about it in polite conversation. And then he said, but now, since Charlie Kirk's assassination or martyrdom, he's talked more about Jesus Christ. He didn't even say God. He said Jesus Christ than ever before. And that, I think, if that attitude holds in his heart, you're going to be a front runner in my book.
Yeah, I appreciated that too, and I really hope that that newfound boldness, even above and beyond his political boldness, but boldness for his faith, is something that we continue to see and that doesn't fade. We know that he was a very close personal friend of Charlie Kirk, and just again, even looking at this article, it talks about the broad coalition that the Trump administration has managed to bring together. A lot of people under the big tent of the Republican Party that a decade ago would not have been there. And a lot of that is due to Trump. A lot of that is also due to Charlie Kirk, who the more that I read about him, even after his death, you see just how effective he was politically. But he was close with J.D. Vance. He was really one of the big players in helping Vance achieve the political success that he has. Another thing I really appreciated was, I don't know if he was the first fill-in host or one of the first, but J.D. Vance actually hosted Charlie Kirk's radio show from the White House. And that was really neat to listen to. It was just a few days after his death, and he ended with a very powerful monologue, I thought, and ended by citing the Nicene Creed on Charlie Kirk's show. And again, and that was even before the memorial. I just thought, wow, how neat is that we have a vice president that is doing that. But definitely something to watch, because there's a lot that Trump has managed to do that we will see if Vance can replicate. But Richard, we've got about a minute left before the break. Any final thoughts on J.D. Vance and this topic of politics as we look ahead to 2028?
Yeah, absolutely. I personally think that, J.D. Vance, I think it's very apt to describe him as kind of Trump 2.0, because he can articulate it in a way that I think maybe even Trump can't do. I think Trump laid the foundation, but J.D. Vance is carrying that forward. And it's something that struck me so much that, people have talked so much about Christian nationalism and the kind of people that Trump surrounds him with and the policies. And there are things that Christians are going to debate and not necessarily agree with. But when I see people being so bold for the gospel and so many of these people being in the highest levels of Trump's administration, I think as a Christian, whatever you agree with or disagree with, I don't know how you can't be happy about that, how you can't be happy about the fact that people who believe in truth and God's word are unafraid to say that at the highest levels of government. How can you not be happy about that? So I think that kind of sums up how I feel.
Yeah. Great words from both of you. So where do we go from here? And so we're going to talk about that and a few other things in the last segment of the Roundtable today when we get back after this short break.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
So glad that you've been with us on the Roundtable today here at Point of View. How do we heal a broken nation? That's what we're going to talk about for the last few moments. You can find this article. It's from the New Guard Press, which is putting out a lot of great pieces that are great food for thought. You can find this article at pointofview.net and read along with us. But, we've been talking about faith, politics, Charlie Kirk's legacy, what's happening right now in America, how many people are being drawn to faith. But the reality is a lot of people are also frightened because As we talked about earlier in the show, we are starting to get a glimpse of what so many of our brothers and sisters in Christ around the world experience all the time. And that's that hard persecution versus the soft persecution. People are realizing, okay, I might actually get killed for my beliefs and for standing up for them boldly. They've seen an example of what that is. And so where do we go from here? Clearly our nation is broken. So we've also kind of adding to a heaviness that a lot of Christians may feel right now. You have, Charlie Kirk's assassination, which was, has been dominating the news still, such a big impact on so many people. But also for those in Christian circles, there have been a lot of faith titans, really, that have died. You had John MacArthur not long ago, Vadi Bakum just last week. We talked about that a little bit in the last hour. But people may be feeling like, okay, all the people that I looked up to or that were boldly speaking the truth are going to heaven. Good for them. But, what does that mean for us? So, Josh, what are your thoughts on that and how we heal and where we go from here?
Yeah, I wonder, as I think about the answer to that question, what the early church felt when they saw Stephen being martyred in Acts chapter 7. You can read about it. Or perhaps when they heard about how Peter had been crucified upside down in Rome, or what they thought of when Paul was killed by Nero, or on and on and on. You could go all the way through history. Even in the book of Revelation, Jesus gives a special word to the church. I believe it's Pergamus, who had witnessed a martyr, Antipas, being put to death for his faith. These great men of the faith passing on and going on before us, we're not the first ones to experience this. And I think that might help us with our perspective. It might give us some strength to know that this is how God has designed the ages until he returns, that it's one generation's turn to lead and to take that message. And then their turn is up, and then it's ours. And I see it as sort of like battle lines. The lines have fallen to us. We're to pick up their spot, stand in the empty place, and hold the line. Continue the fight. If we honor them, then we cannot let the battle end when they die. We've got to continue their fight. And if anything, this has to be the death of great men of God has to be an inspiration to young men of God to become the next great men of God.
Yeah, well said, Josh. Something the article also mentions is that we've seen kind of similar situations throughout U.S. history. So the article's author references George Washington and the period of time right after the American Revolution. The Republic was very young, and people were feeling unsure about the future. Richard, you've done some scholarship on George Washington, to say the least. So I'm wondering what you thought of that parallel and the insights we can glean even from American history.
Absolutely. One thing I was just thinking right now is that, it is one of those things where we mourn the loss of our heroes, our spiritual mentors. And yes, there are things that are daunting and are even scary, and things that are being clarified right now, and people are thinking, am I willing to be as bold as they were? Am I willing to die for my faith? And I also think there's so much we need to rejoice in. We should rejoice in the fact that God has blessed us to be salt and light in this world. We should embrace that. And we should also, and to just kind of meditate on the privilege that is. And also, I think, when I study American history, just like any country's history, it's messy. It's about a group of sinners who are trying to live together. But there's so much about America that is uniquely blessed. And it's uniquely blessed because it was founded on biblical principles. It was founded on the idea that everyone is made equal in the eyes of God. We're made by God, first of all, and we're granted rights. And that is something beautiful and worth celebrating and embracing. And to the extent, a large extent, that our country has been influenced by Scripture, we should be excited about that. I mean, the fact that our system of government is built on checks and balances because of an understanding of human nature, that human nature is sinful and that power should not be concentrated in one branch or one level of government. We should be excited to explain that from a Christian worldview and say this is because of centuries of thinking by Christians and by non-Christians who were within a Christian context. We should praise God for the fact that those truths are so embedded in our country and in our system, and we should be excited to share that with the next generation. You know, I love pointing out that in one of Washington's last statements at the end of the Revolution, he said, America could only be a happy nation if it imitated the divine author of our blessed religion. And Ron Chernow, the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, says that he's talking about none other than Jesus himself. And literally the founder of our country said we could not be a happy nation if we didn't imitate Jesus. And Washington's talking about believer and non-believer alike, because he's talking about Americans, and of whom both believer and non-believer were welcome. And he's saying, hey, we have freedom, but the only way we can have prosperity as a nation, spiritual prosperity, political prosperity, is to imitate the only source of good, which is Jesus. And I think we should be excited to share that kind of history with the next generation, with our kids, and to teach it boldly and explicitly. And I think that's how we can be attractive to people when we share that history.
Yeah, so well said. We are blessed, certainly. And you know, as you pointed out, it has been a journey, even in a blessed nation like America. We're all sinful, but thank God he does not require us to be perfect in order to work through us. And so it has been an encouraging conversation today. If you want to follow Richard and Josh and their work, I encourage you to go to pointofview.net. You can find all of their links. And so it's just been great having them on. And thank you for joining us today on the Roundtable here at Point of View. I'll leave with just a quote from this last article that we mentioned, which you can read at pointofview.net. In his farewell address, after he stepped down from being the very first president of the United States, George Washington encouraged the country to maintain its identity, virtue, wisdom, and liberty under the guidance of heaven. We hope to at least encourage you a little bit in the same way here at Point of View. So Kirby will be back with you tomorrow, so be sure to tune in. And as a reminder, you can still join the Truth Team. You can be a part of the movement that is still bringing biblical clarity to our nation. And I ask that you pray about that. So if you would like to give a gift, one more time, the number is 1-800-347-5151. And as always, you can give easily and quickly at pointofview.net. Thanks for being with us today on Point of View, and Kirby will be with you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
America's founding was shaped by a biblical worldview, but you will rarely hear that truth today. Think about this. If your child or grandchild was asked to articulate how Christian values shaped America's founding based on the education they received in school and from popular media, could they do it? Well, you can be part of restoring an appreciation for America's godly heritage, and we need you. Truth Team Week is right around the corner, kicking off September 22nd, and you're invited to participate in Point of View's mission to restore America's godly heritage and a Christian worldview in this nation by joining the Truth Team. But you don't have to wait to make a difference. You can make a donation right now and learn more about the Truth Team by visiting us online at pointofview.net or by calling 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.